Tom Eaton word al jare lank as een van Suid-Afrika se beste satiriese skrywers en skerpste kommentators beskryf. Hy het nou ook 'n nuwe boek op die rakke getiteld Is it me or is it getting hot in here? Hy sluit by ons aan via Skype. Tom, as someone who uses humor in his writing, I mean, you certainly never run out of material in a country like ours.
Never, although it sometimes can feel like a bit of a stretch to try and wring comedy out of current affairs.
I found your take on the boiling frog analogy in your book quite interesting. It's something that you hear quite often. You see it on social media, and lots of people talk about this analogy of the boiling frog. But as you write, we've got it all wrong.
Yeah, well, I was very familiar, as we all are, with this idea of, we're frogs boiling to death in a pot. We all know this apparent experiment where you put a frog in a pot and slowly turn up the heat, and the frog just sits there and slowly boils to death. And it turns out that experiments were done, in fact, on frogs in boiling pots, and some of the frogs did just passively boil to death, but the ones that passively boiled to death, and this is the important detail that was left out, had their brains surgically removed. And once I realized that it was a flawed analogy, I started thinking about it more, and I started thinking around the way we think about the crises of South Africa and whether these are really helpful ways that we think about them.
Why do you think we like these analogies so much? I mean, as you've just mentioned, the analogy is wrong, but it's almost as if South Africans like this idea of being in a situation where we feel helpless. I mean, we certainly sometimes feel hopeless.
Well, I think, to be fair to stressed, tired, confused South Africans, this is an incredibly stressful time. I don't think we talk about it enough. I mean, we all say, we're stressed and we're angry and we've had enough with corruption, that sort of thing. But I think we seldom say, I'm just tired, I'm exhausted by it. And I think these sorts of analogies speak to that feeling of helplessness, of extreme pessimism. The frog in a pot analogy ends with the frog literally boiling to death. And I think that we gravitate towards these analogies because they seem to represent a future that we fear and feel is quite realistic. And as I said in the foreword to this book, I don't want to try and persuade anyone that things are better than they seem. And that's not my intention here. I don't want to tell people they're imagining the crises, that they should just pull themselves together. That's not my intention at all. But I think that it is important for us to think about the crises that are very real, but in slightly less self-destructive ways.
Tom, you also write about Paris syndrome. I'm not going to repeat the Afrikaanse version, the one you coined in the book. Perhaps you can refer to that. Why is that applicable to South Africa?
Well, Paris syndrome is this syndrome whereby certain tourists apparently arrive in Paris and have a complete nervous breakdown. They just can't handle it, and the reason is that their perceptions, their expectations, are out of line with what they get. So they've grown up imagining that Paris is this place where it's like a scene from Amélie. There's nuns on bicycles, and everyone plays accordion music, and they're eating baguettes while mimes perform in church squares. And they get to Paris, and it's a big, busy, hostile, modern city, and they kind of lose their minds. And I thought about that in terms of a lot of our terrible emotional upset in South Africa, and that perhaps we're suffering from a sort of local version of Paris syndrome, whereby we're expecting the country to be certain things, and when it's not those things, we tend to kind of have a huge emotional reaction and something of a breakdown. And the analogy I use in my book is our politicians, our leaders. We keep expecting them to be leaders because they're in parliament, they're politicians, they should be leaders, and yet they're clearly not. They've been telling us that for a very long time. That's clearly not their intention to lead or run any kind of government. And so because we're expecting leaders, statesmen, administrators, and we don't get that, we go to pieces instead of thinking, well, hang on, they're the problem, not me. So I explore that in the book.
One of the more serious chapters, well, I found it a bit more serious, was the one about politics and sport. You make the case for politics being part of sport and that it should be a part of sport.
Yeah, although I think I should be specific here and say that chapter is, of course, controversial and that people are going to get very angry about it, which is great because that's part of sport. Fighting over sport is part of sport. But the case I make in the book is that politics is an integral part of sport. It's why we have international sport. It's the Olympics is a political event. International sport is the pleasure of watching my country beat your country. So politics is already an integral part of sport. But the point I make is that bad politics should be kept out of sport, and good politics should be allowed to do its job, which is to grease the wheels of the sports we know and love. And again, I think this is an argument that we have slightly clumsily. We get very upset and kind of pull apart into different camps. And so in South Africa, we have the view that politics must be absolutely not part of sport. And then the other view is, well, absolutely, politics must entirely be a part of sport. And I think in that chapter, I've tried to be a little bit more specific and careful about what do we mean by politics, and really, are we talking about good politics or bad politics? Because I think there's a lot of space for good politics in sport.
Tom, thank you so much for your time this evening. Dis al vir vanaand. Dankie dat jy saam gekyk het. Mooi bly.